utility up-to-date modern telecommunications ordinance for our utility users tax. And the Ordinance Committee considered the first draft of that ordinance on April 8th. And at that meeting, the Ordinance Committee asked us to make it very clear in the ordinance, expressly clear in the ordinance, that the utility users tax would not apply to internet access. So that's one of the things we've done. I believe that's at page 6 of the draft. No, I'm wrong about that. 7. At the top there, you'll see this express statement that the ordinance never really said it included internet access, but of course it didn't say it excluded it expressly. So that's what we've done here. And you will also recall that the city's cable TV provider, Cox Communications, has some concerns. They had not been following this, and frankly the city staff had focused more on the traditional telecommunications providers. And of course part of the issue, really what's going on here, is nothing's traditional anymore. And so Cox really wanted some time to react to this ordinance. Mr. Pearson and I met with Mr. Edelman and another representative from Cox about 3 weeks ago now. And then we also had a conference call with several Cox representatives across the country last week. Let me say that my understanding is that part of the concern here is that this ordinance really is dealing with taxation and not regulation. In other words, we're not attempting to do a cable TV ordinance or a video services ordinance here. We're not regulating what Cox may or may not do and what services they may provide, what comes under their franchise, what falls within their franchise fee, or anything like that. All we're trying to do is a taxing ordinance. And one of the main things we're trying to do is come up with a standardized, streamlined ordinance, particularly with respect to definitions. And our special counsel, Don Maynard, tells us that there is something called a streamlined sales and use tax agreement that has been worked on extensively across the country, state and local representatives working with the traditional phone companies, AT&T, Verizon, and they're all in agreement on these definitions, and they're all in understanding that this is only on the tax side of it. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Cox, but part of that is that they're not familiar with that process. One of the things we're dealing with, I think, is that there's probably at least a dozen California cities that have adopted an ordinance like this, virtually identical to this, but they're not in California. They're not Cox cities. I don't believe Cox has actually that many cities within California. And so when Pasadena did this ordinance and Los Angeles did this ordinance, they didn't have to explain it, and Cox didn't have to explain it to Cox, and Cox didn't have to follow it. So anyway, we had that conference call last week. It ended up being more of an informational call where we were attempting to provide Cox, particularly their corporate people in Atlanta, with the information and the resources and the websites and the names of people that they could talk to kind of assure themselves that this isn't going to impact them, and that really what we're trying to do here is get to the level playing field, so that while if Cox provides voice over internet protocol and might have to pay, its customers might have to pay a UUT on that, which is clearly our intent. Anyone else providing a similar service, and not anyone, everyone else providing a similar service, a voice communication service, would be paying the UUT. So no particular utility would be at a competitive disadvantage, and everyone would have a level playing field. As I say, I want to speak for David Edelman or Cox, But I suspect that because that conference call was just last week, that Cox has not had enough time to react and to get their head around the fact that this ordinance is really to all of our advantages, to have this, particularly to use the streamlined sales and use tax approach. And so I think we discussed this, Bob Pearson and I discussed this with the city administrator yesterday, that it may be that we'll need to come back to the ordinance committee next week and give Cox another week to react. It's important when you look at our schedule. We have to back off getting something on the ballot for November, and the county imposes some deadlines on getting the resolutions and the actual language to them. Part of that's driven by their printing deadlines. And when we look at the number of Tuesdays available to get this done, we don't have a whole lot of them. For example, if we come back to you next Tuesday and we're off for Memorial Day weekend, we really need to start getting to this at the council level in mid-June or so. Because I know we don't want to assume that 1 or 2 council hearings are going to be sufficient. That may be the case, but council may want to work with some of the language. The full council may want to work with some of the language of the ordinance. It may want to pay particular attention to the language on the ballot. And of course, some substantive decisions have not been made, like whether we'll reduce the UUT rate or not, that sort of thing. So I don't know if Mr. Pearson has anything he'd like to add.
Mr. Pearson. Councilmember House committee members, Bob Pearson, City Finance Director. No, I think Steve's covered it. I just would add that that really today, I know that Mr. Edelman wants to speak to you, but as far as staff is concerned, the conference call with the Cox representatives was last Friday. So, very recently, and we as staff thought that today we could primarily just kind of give you a status report, and then spend the next week working with Cox and giving them the chance to familiarize themselves with the background information that they were provided last Friday, and see if that affects their perspective on our draft language. And so we would plan to be back to you next week. And as Mr. Wiley said, I think that one way or another, because of the time constraints, we would hope that the Ordinance Committee would be, hopefully at least, ready to move it along to the full council for their consideration, so that we can come back to the full council in early June and get this thing going, so that if we do decide to proceed with a ballot measure, we do it in a time frame that allows us to meet the county imposed election schedule deadline. I'd be glad to answer any questions. I know Mr. Wiley would as well, and I know Mr. Edelman has submitted a speaker slip. So.
Well, let's just do that right away. Mr. Edelman, why don't you come in and address us, and then we'll all have questions. I'm sure maybe you can help us with some of the answers. So.
Thank you. My name is Dave Edelman. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs with Cox here in Santa Barbara. I want to first express my thanks to this committee and then Mr. Pearson and Mr. Wiley for really giving us the opportunity to kind of sit down with them and spend a couple different sessions together. It wasn't one of those sessions where you sit down and we're not going to listen to you, and we're going to. They were truly interested in our ideas and our input, and I really want to thank again Mr. Wiley and Mr. Pearson for that. One of the misconceptions here is that this doesn't affect Cox because it's a pass-through tax for our customers. But I want to assure you, we feel 2 levels of commitment. One is obviously to our customers that are out there that have to pay for their cable services or their phone services, that the more they have to pay, that's always a concern for us. So it really doesn't affect our bottom line, so to speak, but it certainly affects our customers, and it affects the way they perceive what they're paying for our service. If they don't see, this is the cable service, and this is the FCC tax, and this is the franchise fee, and they see the bottom line bill and they pay the bill. So that's really part of our obviously concern here. From a cable television perspective, we see this as a potential reduction in tax. Hopefully, you'll go to 4%. No, just kidding. We see there's a potential reduction on the cable bill for our customers, and we see that as a good thing on that end. I do want to augment what Mr. Wiley said. We were looking at this from a telecom franchise, telecommunications, FCC regulatory perspective, and not from a taxing perspective. So we have engaged our folks in Atlanta to kind of take a look at the language of this, as well as the taxing laws that they all sent us. So any extra time you can give us would be really appreciated. They will look at it from a taxing perspective. What does this mean from a tax? What does this mean, again, on the for the bottom line for the customers? So I appreciate the extra time. Our concern is really, just to share with you a little bit, is in the definition, is page 4, the definite telecommunication services, and it really still talks about data, computer processing, voice over internet protocol, and it says something in here which just, again, this is not from a taxing perspective, and we'll look at it from that perspective. It talks about the term telecommunications, which includes transmission, conveyance, routing, in which computer processing applications are used in a form, code, or protocol of the content for purpose of transmission, conveyance, without regard to whether the services are referred to as VoIP or is classified by the Federal Communications Commission as enhanced or et cetera, and then it talks about data services. The Federal Communication has really never come out with any kind of definition of, from their perspective, what is VoIP? Is it an information service? Is it a telecom service? And the concern here for me, again, not from a taxing perspective, is no matter how they classify it, you're going to still tax it. Whereas in the Internet world, when before Internet service was classified as an information service, we were paying the proper franchise fees tax on it. Once the Federal Communications Commission came out with a definition, we had stopped, and everyone around the country had stopped doing that. So I'm concerned with having different definitions from that perspective. If the Telecommunications Commission, the Federal really classifies it as, I don't know, anything as information service, then it really is not a taxable service, and this language doesn't really address that, but I certainly understand the perspective. The last comment I'll have, and then I'll really be quiet, is in the, and I see this as a real attempt on page 7 to really take out the whole issue of Internet. The language for me, and this is just personally, is kind of a little bit, doesn't quite get there for me, because it talks about the telecommunications, does not include telecommunications that are dedicated or used exclusively for Internet access. And we know today people are not using exclusively their Internet access for, they're using their Internet access for video, for voice, for other kinds of services. And I think the intent is certainly there, and I'm just not sure if that language gets there. But clearly, you don't want to tax services that provide Internet. And I don't know how for you to say that, but I'm not quite sure if this language, dedicated or used exclusively, is the right language. And that's really just some feedback to you all and to your staff to kind of take a look at that. I'm available to answer any questions that you may have of me. And again, thank you for actually the extra time to let our tax people look at it from a taxing perspective.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Questions for staff? Or Mr. Edelman, I guess he seems to be available. Yes, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Pearson, have we spoken with other service providers besides Cox, or has anyone else shown any interest in this?
Chairman House, Councilmember Francisco, no, city staff has not spoken to any other telecom providers. I do know that Mr. Maynor, our consulting attorney on this, has worked extensively and closely over an extended period of time with carriers such as Verizon and AT&T. And so we didn't feel the need to personally talk to any of these people. I will say that to my knowledge, and I'm pretty knowledgeable about this, in the 25 to 30 California cities that have taken a modern telecom UUT ordinance to their voters in the last 2 years, in not one instance has AT&T or Verizon opposed the modernized version. They have stayed on the sidelines, which, as you may know, at least from my experience, is tantamount to support for those two companies. So the answer directly to your question is no, but I think it's safe to say that they have been involved with this process for 2 or 3 years at least. And I think the evidence of that is that even in the city of LA, which has a utility tax, was 10% and was reduced on their modernization vote to 9%, which is 50% more than our 6% tax. Neither Verizon nor AT&T were involved in that campaign in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mayor Bloom?
I appreciate the fact that Cox has gotten active in this, because I think it's a good idea that they know up front what's happening, and I'm kind of disappointed that we're the first city that's doing this. That's always hard. I mean, the first Cox Communications cable city that's doing this, and it's always hard to be the first one. So, but you can understand that we have a deadline here too, so that's the hard part, and so I hope we can give you enough time to get some feedback. And you know, I'm not sure whether we should be, you know, we probably at some point when we go to put it on the ballot, we need to tell, you know, AT&T and Verizon, and I don't know if we have any other. Do you know if we have any other providers in our city?
Chairman House, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, I don't know.
No, we're a Verizon community when
Yeah.
it comes to wired, old-fashioned telephone service.
Right.
And so AT&T is not here. I can, again, Mr. Maynor, I'm sure, is able to communicate with, he has contacts that he's dealt with consistently and regularly over time, and I certainly have no problem asking Mr. Maynor to make sure that Verizon, for example, is aware of the fact that this is coming. Frankly, with their extensive government relations operations that those regulated companies have, I'm sure they're already aware of it, but it certainly wouldn't hurt to make sure.
Yeah.
I'd rather have them know early on than to have them show up in, you know, late October, wondering, you know, so
Right
yes.
as people are starting to vote.
Right.
That's not good.
So
Yeah.
we will make sure we do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that was a good idea from Mr. Francisco, and it looks like it's a good, you know, it looks like it's a very tight ordinance. I had read it through, but I don't have any questions.
Okay. I have a couple.
Okay.
And let's see. Let's look on page 6 for a second. And this is where it begins that D section there where it says certain exclusions. And I was noticing that on the video side, right after the introductory paragraph of A, the next paragraph is actually talking about what's included, the video charges on the next page. But we don't do that on the side of telecommunications, and we call them services instead of charges, whereas on video it's charges. And in the exclusions, we use the first part of that paragraph to talk about what's included, and then we have a couple of sentences at the end that talk about what's excluded. And part of this goes along with what I'd commented last time, and it had to do with the plain languageness of it. It would seem like what we'd want to do in 426040 is to have that introductory paragraph talking about establishment of the tax, then identify what it is that we're covering, or what's going to be taxed, what charges are taxed, not necessarily services, but charges are going to be taxed, and then identify what things are excluded. Kind of right there at the very beginning, and so I just wondered about that as far as not just placement on a page, but in terms of consistency and clarity. And why are we using the word services on one side and charges on another? Are those technical terms that we need to? And I don't know who should answer those best. Mr. Wiley?
Mr. Chair, I'd actually have to ask Mr. Maynard why. And I actually see some places where he's been making some changes, and we recently asked him to do one final cut at little things like that.
Okay.
But I'd have to ask him why the difference. I have this general understanding that the concept of video services, we're having the whole industry, if you will, public entities and UUT are having a little bit of a hard time getting our hands around that, the concept. And that is not so much the case with telecommunications that we're, so.
Okay, well, I raised that, it's just something I noticed. And let's see. And I can understand, and I think we all get the gist of Mr. Edelman's remarks here about the way that phrase on the top of page 7 there is, and to be sure that it really gets technically correct and it reads right for everyone, Cox and everybody, so it's clear that we're not taxing the internet. I mean, it just really clarifies that. And then, let's see, and I guess I'd already underlined that thing that he had mentioned on the VoIP deal over there on that page 4. Okay, I think that was it. Oh, and then it seems like there's would you turn to page 17? I just want to be sure I understand this as you had intended. On A, at the top of the page, the last sentence, it seems like that's really the operant, one of the operant sentences in this whole deal in terms of getting ahead of the class action kind of situation. Am I correct in understanding that sentence?
Is this section .170?
Yes.
Yeah.
The last sentence of
Section A.
Nothing shall permit.
I just wanted to be sure I understood that. That's what we were talking about early on, and it's important that that's stated plainly. Page 17, section 170, 426170 appeals, letter A, first paragraph, last sentence. Nothing herein shall.
Right, yeah, I'm sorry. That is about claims. Let me just say generally, and this is somewhat a very fundamental issue in this ordinance, because, for lack of a better term, we call this the technology shift, or the evolving technology continues to evolve. This ordinance tries to build some real flexibility into it, but telling everyone what we intend to tax. We intend to tax what we used to call telephone service, even if it isn't technically telephone, if it provides that same sort of service, we intend to tax it. And we intend to tax video, even though it wouldn't be considered traditional cable TV, things like that. So this, we've got this, we call it the tax administrator, which is essentially the finance director, and the ability to issue rulings, to issue interpretations. In both ways. In some cases, these interpretations would apply the tax to new areas that it involve, or it might not apply the tax to other new areas. And this is this flexibility, particularly if we do essentially this model ordinance that many other cities have done. We'll have the benefit of a ruling from LA or from Pasadena interpreting a new thing. So some of this, when it's not all that clear what's happening, it's like it's part of the flexibility of this ordinance to react to the evolution of these changes.
But the evolution would be based on court decisions, or in other words, it's not just sort of arbitrary open-endedness, it's based on something substantive occurring that would relate directly to this. Okay. My last thing, I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I think that one of the things that we've learned from our experience of late is that our current UUT ordinance as it relates to telecommunications is virtually identical to the majority of California cities that have telecommunications UUT ordinances. And I think we've seen both the benefits and the drawbacks of that in that we're not the biggest fish in the sea, obviously, and so when the telecommunications companies filed suit against certain cities over their telecommunications UUT ordinance in the wake of the IRS's decision to suspend the federal excise tax, they didn't sue Santa Barbara, they sued LA and other large cities. And one of the advantages to having an ordinance that parallels everyone else's is that it does, as Mr. Wiley indicates, since we're not generally the one in the lead on these kinds of things and the bigger cities are, it really does mean that we are all in the same boat together. And so not only is that supposedly an advantage for the companies that administer this tax on all of the city's behalfs, including, Cox Communications, other cable companies, and the Verizon and AT&T, but it means that when administrative rulings or court decisions are handed down, that we get that guidance and we can rely on that guidance because our ordinance is essentially the same as the others. Now that's cuts both ways. It's worked against us in the current environment because we all reference the federal excise tax, and so everyone's heading to the ballot box. But it also means that there's an upside on the routine day-to-day administration of it. And so I really think that there is a huge value in sticking with essentially the same ordinance. And I think that administering the ordinance, and that's absolutely right what Mr. Wiley says, is that we've had to issue administrative rulings on our own UUT currently, our current version of it. We've, in the past, have had to. And Mr. Maynor has been able to come to us and say, all my clients are doing this, the city of LA is doing this, and all of these cities, this is how they're handling it. And because our ordinance was effectively the same as theirs, we could rely on that without having to go out and get separate legal opinions and worry about that. So I think that that's just one of the advantages of the consistency and the wording of the ordinance.
Okay. Would you, on page 13, would one of you explain this is a big addition to what we had last time, and it's the, on 426-120, administrative remedy, 130, additional powers, and then there's this section that's all been added, and I was trying to follow that exactly and to see what it got us, and could one of you just put that in layman's terms for us?
Well, this is a good example of what I was just talking about. You'll see about 2/3 of the way down a reference to a government code section, 53-750. That is part of the Prop 218 Implementation Act. And Prop 218 was approved by the voters in 1996, and it's a constitutional amendment, but being a constitutional amendment, it almost by definition didn't contain a lot of detail or explanation that typically is needed. And so the state legislature came in with the Prop 218 Implementation Act, and they couldn't, since it was a proposition, they couldn't violate it, and they didn't want to. They weren't trying to, but they were trying to explain it. And one of the big things these statutes, 53-750, explains is you can reduce the tax. It's not a violation of Prop 218 to interpret a tax such a way that it doesn't apply to something. And that's what this language says, that the tax administrator, Bob, the finance director, can issue a ruling saying, oh, okay, well, we didn't think about that, and there might be some questionable legality of applying the tax to that. Let's say, I don't know, direct broadcast satellite telephone or something like that. So, or telephone over your electric wires. I heard of that once. You'd plug a telephone into an outlet. I don't know. It was, okay, well, it doesn't apply to that. And because there's some questionable legality, and until the courts rule on it, that the city would say, we're going to issue an administrative ruling saying you don't have to collect the tax. Because if we collect it and then lose in some court case later, there's just going to be a mess to have to be cleaned up.
Right.
So that's what that's
And this is almost a severability. There's one for severability too, but this is almost a severability type clause in here too. That if you did have that one particular thing got reduced, it doesn't affect all the rest.
Mr. Chair, if I might add one more specific example to that, I think you may recall in the wake of the highly successful deregulation of electric utilities in this state some years ago, and of course I say that dripping with sarcasm. You remember that the electric rates skyrocketed, and there was this big crisis because electric rates were going up dramatically. Many cities wanted to consider suspending or lowering their utility tax on electricity during that crisis in order to assist citizens with the higher cost of electricity. However, they were getting legal advice that to do so might jeopardize the return to the normal rate afterwards, because people would argue that you lowered the rate, and now by raising it back up to its original level that you were violating Prop 218. And so many cities, despite the fact that they wanted to do that, felt constrained from risking it for fear of being challenged at such time as when the crisis passed and they said, okay, now we're going to put the tax back at its normal level, its previous level, that they would be challenged legally, that was a violation of 218. And the way I read this is, in addition to what Mr. Wiley is saying, which is clearly an important point, that this preserves our flexibility to decide on interim basis that we are going to suspend or lower the tax. It would have to be an extraordinary event, I grant you, but and then we would still have the legal right to put it back to where it was without risking legal challenges.
Does not waive or abrogate its ability to impose in full, et cetera. Okay, I understand.
Mr. Chair, that's a perfect example, and particularly when you think that this language would be approved by the voters. See, what happened when a lot of cities wanted to lower their UUT on electricity during deregulation was that, as Bob said, they were concerned they couldn't raise it back up. But in this case, we'd have the ability to do it, go to a judge and say, Judge, the voters authorized us to do this and to raise it back up when the appropriate.
A temporary reduction
Right.
is what you're talking about. Okay, either of you have any other comments today?
Good.
I had one last thing then, and that was, I believe that in the staff report, it was in plain language what the funds could be used for. That's really seemed to me very easy to understand, and you could, explain this to someone from here. What's still missing for me is the elevator speech on what this is taxing. I mean, you really have to work at it to get there, and I don't know that those that are in the ballot box are going to, certainly the language and all has to come later at some point, but if I'm trying to explain to a friend of mine what it is and what it isn't, I have a hard time still. I mean, I get it. It takes me a minute. I can work back through it. I could show them this and all. But to simplify to have a simple preamble, or maybe even it doesn't come up in this place here, but it shows as part of the staff report what we're taxing and what we're not, would be, I think it'd be very helpful to all of us who feel that this, I do feel like we're on the right track with this, but perhaps next time it comes back to us, a little effort on staff's part could go a long way.
Well, Mr. Chair,
Wiley.
one of the problems, Bob and I were hoping that we didn't have to do a staff report for next Tuesday, because really we're just waiting to hear from Cox.
Okay.
And I would prefer to put something like that in a staff report and not in a preamble, because it's really.
A staff report's okay, Steve. My point is that it's extremely important that when we have these hearings like this, or when it comes to council, that for anyone who looks at the agenda and wants to know what's coming up, and that they don't have to dig their way through the whole thing, that they get that synopsis. And I think that's been accomplished in terms of what it's used for, but I don't think it's been accomplished in terms of what's being taxed. And if you could do that between now and when it comes to council, it would be very helpful.
Council, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I do have one.
Yes, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wiley, could you run through that schedule one more time that you were talking about? I just want to make sure that we're on track for that.
Mr. Francisco, the schedule I received this morning requires, it's easier to back into it. The county needs from us the exact wording of the measure and the request for approval of the Board of Supervisors for consolidation by July 3rd. And I don't know what day of the week that is, Thursday. So that basically gives us June to act on. I know a couple of things there's a meeting on council on June 3rd, but that's also election day, and we understand that council would prefer that to be fairly light. I also happen to be taking a vacation that day, and I prefer to be here for the council meeting. So we're looking at, I think then June 10th or June 17th. I believe this schedule anticipates that we would be going to council on June 24th with the substantive actions, with the actual adoption of the election resolutions, the declaration of a fiscal emergency, which we're going to need in order to place this on the November 2008 ballot, which then means we'd probably be looking at a more conceptual discussion at the council level on June 17th.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think if we do our work well here, it should only take one discussion at council.
Yeah.
I seriously doubt that most people are going to be interested in getting into the minutia of this.
Well, that goes a little bit to what I was just saying about the way the staff report, and for whomever reads it, that it doesn't raise fears unnecessarily, that it actually is very clear about what's being covered and about, we know what people are concerned about it, 'cause we want to make sure they're clear it's not covering that. But it also means that I think that this conversation with the Cox and their representatives is critical, and to the degree that, is it Mr. Maynor?
Yes.
Could be available or whatever to answer questions because of the consistency with other jurisdictions. Maybe he'd be able to answer questions and save an extra phone call or two. But whatever we can do to really get their input and make sure that it's appreciated here.
Well, I can only say that, and I know that Mr. Edelman knows this because we've told him this, is that Mr. Wiley, myself, and Mr. Maynor are available to Mr. Edelman or any Cox representative at any time, and I know that they all have Mr. Maynor's direct contact information now, and we've told them feel free to just pick up the phone and call Don or email him at any time. And so,
Okay, very good.
You know, we will certainly do what we can, and we appreciate Cox's constructive approach to this very much.
Okay, very good. Is there anybody who wants to address us on anything that's not on our agenda today? Nope. Okay, very good. Then we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.